They fired him in front of everyone, not in a back office, not with HR on the phone, not with a letter slid across at a desk. Victor Okafor was called to the center of the shop floor at Hartwell Precision Engineering in Sudbury, Ontario, on a Tuesday morning in March, and Diane Ashworth, the plant's new chief operations officer, 4 months into the job, told him to hand in his badge while 23 of his colleagues stood watching with their eyes down and their hands still. He was 51 minutes late. That was the whole of it, as far as Diane Ashworth was concerned. Victor had worked at Hartwell for 11 years. He had rebuilt a compressor assembly that saved the Lakehead turbine contract. He had trained 6 of the technicians currently standing on that floor. He had missed exactly 2 shifts in 11 years, both of them the week his wife Eleanor died. Diane Ashworth had been at Hartwell for 4 months and had never once set foot in the service bay. She didn't ask why he was late. She didn't look at his file. She read from a printed page, something about punctuality being a condition of employment, about the critical nature of the morning's scheduled inspection for the Halverson municipal contract, and she told Victor to collect his things and leave. Victor didn't argue. He looked at her for a moment, the way a man looks at something he doesn't yet have words for. Then he looked at the floor. Then he reached into his chest pocket and placed his keycard on the work table beside him. Not in her hand. On the table. He walked to his locker, put his thermos and his reading glasses and a photograph of his daughter into his canvas bag, and he walked out through the side door into the cold. He didn't say anything to anyone. He didn't have to. The shop floor was so quiet when he left that you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. His daughter's name was Cleo. She was 7 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness in equal measure. Eleanor had died of a pulmonary embolism 18 months earlier, very suddenly, on a Saturday afternoon in September, between making lunch and folding laundry. Cleo had been in the backyard when it happened. Victor had been the one who found Eleanor, and he was the one who sat on the kitchen floor for a long time afterward, and he was also the one who had to go outside and tell Cleo that things were going to be different now. He had raised her alone since then, in the house they'd bought on Pineridge Crescent, a narrow 2-story with a birch tree in the front yard and a furnace that knocked every time the temperature dropped below -10. He drove her to school in the mornings, packed her lunch the night before, and picked her up from after-school care at 5:15. On weekends they made pancakes. She insisted on blueberries, always, even in winter, even when the blueberries came from a bag and tasted like cold cardboard. Victor bought them anyway. He had structured his entire life around a very specific geometry of time. Leave the house by 7:40, drop Cleo at school by 8:10, arrive at Hartwell by 8:30, pick up at 5:15, home by 5:40, dinner by 6:30, Cleo in bed by 8:30. He had been doing this for 18 months, and it had kept them both upright, this geometry. It was the only architecture available to him. The morning of the Tuesday in March, the geometry collapsed. It started the night before at 11:40 when Victor got a call from the overnight dispatch at Hartwell. This was not unusual. He was one of 2 senior technicians who kept their phones on for emergencies, and emergencies in precision manufacturing tended to announce themselves at inconvenient hours. The call was from Marv, the night supervisor, who explained that the Halverson inspection vehicle, a modified municipal utility truck that Hartwell had been contracted to recertify, had developed a fault in its hydraulic lift system sometime in the previous 6 hours. The morning inspection was scheduled for 9 o'clock. A city engineer would be present. The contract renewal was contingent on a clean certification. Marv said they'd already tried to reach the other senior tech. No answer. Victor said he'd be there in 20 minutes. He drove to Hartwell in the dark, let himself in through the service entrance, and spent the next 7 hours working on the hydraulic system. The fault turned out to be more embedded than the initial diagnostics suggested. A failed seal compounded by particulate in the fluid line, which had created a pressure inconsistency that would have failed the inspection and potentially compromised the lift mechanism under load. Victor drained the system, replaced the seal, flushed the line, bled the hydraulics, and ran 4 successive pressure tests before he was satisfied. He finished at 6:47 in the morning. He cleaned up, filed a preliminary note in the service logbook, and drove home. He needed to shower, change, and get Cleo to school. Mrs. Bertrand from next door had agreed weeks ago to be the backup for mornings exactly like this one, where Victor's schedule came apart at the seams. He called her from the car. Mrs. Bertrand didn't pick up. He called again from the driveway. Nothing. He went inside, woke Cleo, got her dressed, made her toast, packed her bag, all of it in the compressed, slightly frantic rhythm of a man working against the clock. He called Mrs. Bertrand a third time. He tried her daughter's number, which he had for emergencies. The daughter said her mother had come down with something in the night and wasn't able to help this morning. She was sorry. She hoped Victor understood. Victor understood. He drove Cleo to school himself. The morning traffic on Paris Street was worse than usual. A fender collision near the intersection with Notre Dame backed everything up for 6 blocks. He sat in it and watched the clock on the dash and did the math, and understood that the math was not going to work. He dropped Cleo at the school door at 8:43. She hugged him around the middle before she went in, the way she always did, with her whole self, both arms, her face pressed into his coat. He arrived at Hartwell at 9:21. He had been working there since midnight, but nobody knew that yet. Nobody knew, because the overnight entry he had made in the service logbook had not been carried forward into the morning system. Marv, who was supposed to flag it for handover, had forgotten, and the logbook itself was in the service bay, not on the floor manager's desk. Victor had intended to speak with the floor supervisor when he arrived and explain everything. He had not intended to arrive to find Diane Ashworth standing in the center of the floor with a printed termination notice and 23 witnesses. He didn't get to explain anything. The floor supervisor's name was Leonard Price. Len had been at Hartwell for 14 years, 3 more than Victor, and he ran the production floor with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't announce itself and doesn't need to. He knew every machine, every contract, every technician's particular strengths and limitations. He was the person Diane Ashworth had been briefed by when she arrived at Hartwell, and he was the person who had in those 4 months developed a carefully professional and thoroughly private assessment of her. Len was in the parts room when Victor was dismissed. He heard it secondhand from 2 different people within the same 10 minutes, and both accounts agreed on the essential facts. Victor had walked in at 9:20, Ashworth had been waiting, and it was over in less than 4 minutes. Len went to the service bay. The service logbook was on the bench where it always was, open to the previous night's entries. Victor's handwriting was in the overnight column, neat, precise, the kind of handwriting that belongs to people who write things down because they intend to be accountable for them. Midnight entry, vehicle ID, fault description, parts used, pressure test results, 4 of them, 0647. Len looked at the logbook for a moment. Then he took out his phone and took a photograph of the page. Then he went and found Diane Ashworth. She was in her office on the upper level, the glass-walled one that looked out over the floor, reviewing something on her laptop. Len knocked once and opened the door without waiting to be invited. He was not normally a man who did that. She looked up, and something in his face made her sit back in her chair. He told her, plainly and without preamble, what he had found in the service logbook. He told her what Victor had done. The midnight call, the 7 hours of work, the hydraulic system, the 4 pressure tests, the fact that the Halverson inspection vehicle was currently sitting in Bay 3 in full working order because Victor had spent the night making it so. He told her that Victor had gone home to get his daughter to school because he had no one else to do it. He told her that the morning entry hadn't been flagged at handover, and that Victor had arrived late, yes, but that he had arrived late to his own workplace, after working through the night for that workplace without being asked to stay, and that the city engineer had certified the Halverson vehicle at 9:45 that morning, and the contract renewal was, as of right now, secure. He put his phone on her desk, face up, with the photograph of the logbook on the screen. He said, "He spent the whole night fixing the inspection vehicle, and you fired him for being late to the job he'd been doing since midnight." Diane Ashworth looked at the photograph. She looked at it for a long time. Len waited. He was good at waiting. She said, finally, "Why didn't he say anything?" Len looked at her. "You didn't ask." Victor had driven home after leaving Hartwell and sat in the kitchen for a while without taking his coat off. The house was quiet in the particular way it was always quiet on weekday mornings, the particular absence of Cleo, of her noise and her running and her constant requests for things. He had grown used to that quiet, but today it felt different. Today it felt like the quiet of a situation he didn't fully understand yet. He wasn't angry, exactly. Or if he was, it was buried under something heavier, a kind of fatigue so deep it had its own geography. He had worked for 11 years at Hartwell. He had never once had cause to defend his reliability or his work ethic. He had believed, in the uncomplicated way that reasonable people sometimes believe things without examining them too closely, that 11 years of showing up was its own kind of argument, that a record like his was a language people could read. It turned out Diane Ashworth did not read that language. He made coffee he didn't drink and sat with it until it was cold. Then he opened his laptop and looked at his savings and did some arithmetic about the mortgage and the grocery bill and Cleo's after-school fees, and concluded that he had approximately 4 months before the arithmetic stopped working. He closed the laptop. He wasn't ready to think about that yet. What he thought about instead was Eleanor, which is what he did when things became too large to organize. He thought about the way she used to sit at that same table on Saturday mornings, with her reading glasses pushed up on her head and her mug held in both hands, and how she had a way of making stillness feel like enough. He had not managed to learn that particular skill from her. He suspected it was not teachable. He was still sitting at the table when his phone rang. It was Len Price. Len was not a man who used many words on the phone, and what he said was brief. He said that Victor should come back to Hartwell, not tomorrow, not next week, now, if he could manage it. Victor asked why. Len said, "Because some things need to be said in person." Victor drove back to Hartwell for the second time that day. He felt, on that drive, something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite dread, something in the vicinity of both, the kind of suspension that sits between knowing something is coming and not yet knowing its shape. Len met him at the service entrance. They went up the side staircase to the upper level. Diane Ashworth was already in the small conference room across from her office, sitting at the table. There was a third person in the room that Victor didn't recognize. A man in his 50s with reading glasses around his neck and the bearing of someone who spent time in boardrooms. Len introduced him as Jeffrey Harker, Hartwell's VP of Operations, who had driven up from the regional office in Sault Ste. Marie that afternoon. Victor sat down. Nobody thanked him for coming. Len sat to his right and didn't say anything further. Jeffrey Harker introduced himself formally and said that he had reviewed the service logbook, the overnight dispatch records, the pressure test data, and the certification report from the Halverson inspection. He said that he wanted Victor to hear directly from him that the record was clear and that Hartwell's position in the matter was equally clear. Diane Ashworth said, "I owe you an apology." She said it looking at the table first and then looking at him. Her voice was even, controlled, the voice of a person who had rehearsed the sentence but was still finding it difficult to say. Victor looked at her and said nothing for a moment. He wasn't playing a game. He was simply deciding what was true. He said, "I should have called ahead. When I realized I was going to be late, I should have called the floor and explained. I know that. I was managing a few things at once and I didn't do that, and I'm not saying that to excuse the rest of it, just to be accurate." Diane Ashworth blinked. Jeffrey Harker said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Len, to Victor's right, made a sound that was not quite a word. Victor continued, "But you fired me in front of the floor. 23 people. Without asking why I was late, without looking at the logbook that was 20 feet from where you were standing, and I've worked here for 11 years. He let that sit. So I'm glad you're sorry. But I need to understand what that means practically." Jeffrey Harker set both hands on the table. He said that Victor's termination was being rescinded immediately and would be expunged from his employment record. He said that Hartwell would be issuing a formal written acknowledgement of the circumstances, and that Victor would be compensated for the missed time. He said that the overnight call-out procedure would be reviewed within the month to ensure that handover communications between shifts were mandatory and logged, and that situations like the one that had occurred, where a technician working an overnight shift arrived late to the following morning with no visible record of the reason, would not occur again. Victor listened to all of this carefully. Then he said, "And what about the floor?" Jeffrey Harker looked at him. "The floor. The 23 people who watched me hand in my badge. Some of them have been here longer than I have. They need to know what actually happened, not from me telling them later in the parking lot, from the company." Out loud. On the floor. There was a silence in the room. Jeffrey Harker said, "That's a fair request." Diane Ashworth said, "I'll do it." Victor looked at her. She said, "I'll address the floor myself. I'll explain what happened and I'll explain what I missed and I'll make it clear that the decision I made this morning was wrong." She paused. "I should have asked why you were late before I did anything else. That's basic. I didn't do that, and I should have, and I'm going to say that out loud to the people who saw me not do it." Victor looked at her for a long time. He said, "All right." They went down to the floor at 4:15 after the second shift had started, and the first shift hadn't yet fully cleared. Len had quietly made sure of the timing. There were 31 people on the floor when Diane Ashworth walked to the center of it, which was the same place she had stood that morning, and asked for a moment's attention. She was brief. She didn't perform remorse or try to explain it away. She said that Victor Okafor had been called in overnight to address a critical fault in the Halverson inspection vehicle, that he had worked through the night and completed the repair, and that he had arrived late that morning because he had gone home to take care of his daughter after working since midnight. She said that she had not asked him why he was late before she acted. She said that was a failure of process and judgment on her part, and that Victor's dismissal was being reversed effective immediately. She said, "You deserve to see me get this wrong. You deserve to see me correct it." Nobody clapped. That wasn't that kind of moment. But the quality of the silence was different from the silence of the morning. It was the silence of people who had been waiting to breathe and had just been given permission. Victor was standing to the side near the parts room door. He wasn't in the center of it. He didn't feel the need to be. A technician named Pete, who had been at Hartwell for 8 years and who Victor had trained on the lathe press in his first week, caught Victor's eye from across the floor and gave him a single nod, small, unhurried, the kind of nod that carries 11 years of shared mornings in it. Victor nodded back. He picked Cleo up from after-school care at 5:20, 5 minutes late, which was almost never. She came out the door at a run in the way she always did, backpack swinging, her braids coming loose at the ends the way they always did by mid-afternoon. She hit him mid-torso and grabbed on, and he caught her and held on, and for a moment he just stood there in the cold air of the parking lot with his arms around her and his eyes closed. She pulled back and looked at his face with the focused diagnostic attention that 7-year-olds sometimes apply to adults without knowing they're doing it. "What happened?" she said. "Something hard happened," he said, "and then something good happened." She considered this. Which one happened last? The good one. She seemed satisfied with that. She took his hand and they walked to the car. He buckled her in and started the engine and let it warm up for a minute the way he always did in March, when the cold still sat in the metal and needed coaxing out. He looked at her in the rearview mirror. She was already looking out the window at something, her breath making a small fog on the glass. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about her often, still, but tonight it was different. Not the heavy ache of grief, but something softer. Something like gratitude for the fact that Eleanor had existed at all, that she had sat at that kitchen table, that she had taught Cleo to make pancakes, which Cleo now insisted on making herself with an intensity that brooked no assistance, that she had loved them both in the specific and unrepeatable way that she had. He thought about what Len had done that morning, how Len had walked into a glass-walled office and put a photograph on a desk without saying please first, how Len had said out loud what needed to be said, in the way that sometimes only one person in a room is willing to do. Victor had thanked him afterward, briefly, outside the service entrance. Len had said, "You'd have done the same." Victor had said, "I'd like to think so." Len had said, "I know so," and that was the end of it. He made dinner that night pasta because Cleo liked it and because he was too tired to think of anything more ambitious. They ate at the kitchen table, and Cleo told him about a disagreement she'd had at recess with a girl named Simone, and Victor listened and asked questions and did not offer solutions, because Eleanor had taught him that listening without solving was often the more useful thing. After dinner, Cleo drew at the table while he washed up, working on something with considerable concentration, a house, or possibly a spaceship. It was difficult to say from the angle he had. She narrated as she drew, which was a habit she'd had since she was 4, this running commentary on her own creative process, and he listened to it while he washed the plates and was, in some fundamental sense, at peace. He thought about the meeting in the conference room, about what it had felt like to sit across from Diane Ashworth and hear the word apology, and find that it mattered, but that it didn't fix anything on its own, that the fixing was in the other parts, the rescission, the acknowledgement, the 4:15 moment on the floor, that the word alone would have been insufficient. He respected her for understanding that, even if she'd had to be pointed toward it. He thought about the Halverson inspection vehicle sitting in Bay 3, with its hydraulic system running clean and a certification stamp on its paperwork and the contract renewal secured for another 18 months. Nobody was going to know that the contract had come within 3 hours of falling apart. Nobody except Marv and Len and the city engineer and Victor himself. It was the kind of thing you didn't talk about at the dinner table. It was the kind of thing you just carried. He dried his hands and hung up the dish towel and looked at Cleo drawing at the table. He thought, this is what the work is for, not the contract, not the certification. The kitchen at 6:30, the drawing, the pasta, the blueberries she would inevitably ask for in the morning, from the bag in the freezer, tasting like cardboard, non-negotiable. He thought, you can fire a man from a job, you cannot fire him from his life. He said, bedtime in 20 minutes. Cleo said, 15 more minutes, which was her standard counteroffer, regardless of the original number. He said, all right, 15. She looked up from the drawing and smiled at him, the smile that was Eleanor's smile, the one that came from somewhere, behind the eyes first. And then she looked back down at whatever she was making. The furnace knocked once, somewhere below them, finding its rhythm in the cold. Victor sat down at the table across from her, and the night settled in around the two of them, ordinary and intact.